This morning's reading is from Colossians chapter 1, verses 15 to 20, and that can be found on page 1182 of the Church Bibles. That's 1182 in the Church Bibles. Colossians 1, starting at verse 15. The Son is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For in him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities. All things have been created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. And he is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning and the firstborn from among the dead, so that in everything he might have the supremacy. For God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross. This is the word of the Lord. Be to God.
Well, good morning, everyone. Please do keep your Bibles open at Colossians 1, 15 to 20. They're great words, aren't they? They're amazing words. Let's ask for God's help as we dig into them together. Father, these are wonderful words indeed. So please, by your Spirit, help us to understand them rightly. Help us to become more like Christ as we reflect on them and as we respond to them for your glory's sake. Amen. Well, if you've used a self-service checkout in a supermarket or you've been to a particular kind of shop, you might have seen something a little bit like this. If you haven't, let me tell you what it is. It's a satisfaction survey. So the question is, as you finish up on that checkout, how good was your experience with us today? How satisfied were you with your experience with us today? I don't know, if you're anything like me, you don't bother pressing any of the buttons. But I want to ask us this morning, if we were to ask the same question about our Christian lives, how would you answer? How satisfied are you with your Christian life? So, very satisfied, you'd press the green smiley face. Completely dissatisfied, you touch the red sad face. And somewhere in the middle where you'd be amber, orange, whatever you want to call that. So which face would you tap? How satisfied are you with your Christian life? I guess as Christians we kind of think sometimes, don't we? We probably should be pressing the green. We probably should be pressing the green, but life can be really hard, can't it? Sometimes we can feel just dissatisfied with how things are in the Christian life. Maybe we are dissatisfied with our own godliness. We really want to change in a particular area, but we just feel like we can't. We're dissatisfied with our own godliness. Or maybe we feel dissatisfied about church life. Church week by week. It just feels like a bit of a plod. Or maybe we just feel a little bit flat as a Christian. Nothing is really going on, it feels like, in our lives. God just feels a bit distant. So what does God say about all of this? And I think our passage this morning really speaks into that area of how satisfied, how fulfilled we feel in our Christian lives. The letter to the Colossians is written by the Apostle Paul to a group of Christians in modern-day Turkey. They were going well in their faith. He's given thanks for them in chapter 1. But Paul, he's really aware of the dangers of the Christian life. The danger of dissatisfaction. The danger of going searching for fulfillment and satisfaction elsewhere, places that just can't satisfy. So in chapter 1, the verses before the verses we looked at this morning, chapter 1, verses 3 to 14, Paul prays a prayer for them. And I think it's a prayer for deep satisfaction. It's a prayer that they would experience this in their Christian lives. If we just scan over those verses 3 to 14, have a look at some of the things he prays for them. And just imagine if all this were true of you and me. Imagine if it was. That God would fill them with the knowledge of his will. That they would have wisdom and understanding, all wisdom and understanding. That they would please God in every way, in every single area of their lives. That they would please God. And he goes on, doesn't he? A huge prayer for them. A prayer that in their Christian lives they would feel, they would know the satisfaction that God promises. But it just sounds a bit like a fantasy. If I'm honest, it sounds like a fantasy as I read it. But Paul says that these things are reality. These things are possible for Christians. These things are open to us in the Christian life. So the big question as we come to chapter 1, verses 15 to 20, is how? How is it possible? And to begin his answer, Paul shows them and us, Jesus. And we might think of our verses today a bit like Jesus' CV, a CV for Jesus Christ. So who is he? What's he done? What has he achieved? These verses read a bit like a CV for Jesus. And at the top of the CV, you always have, at the top of the CV, you have his name, don't you? You have your name. Jesus Christ. But in brackets, it's got God. Jesus, the Son, is the image of the invisible God. It's not just that he looks like God. He's the image of God. It means that everything that can be said about Jesus can be said about God. His nature, his attributes, what he does, his relationships. Jesus is the image of God. Jesus is God. And so, next section on the CV, you normally have date of birth, don't you? Jesus, what's your date of birth? Well, in that date of birth section, there's no date. It just says firstborn over all creation, verse 15. Jesus has always existed. The Son of God has always existed. It wasn't just that he came into existence when he was born of Mary. No, he has always existed. He always will exist. He is the firstborn. That's one sense of firstborn. The other sense of firstborn is just simply king. Jesus is king. Firstborn is kind of Bible language for king. We see that if we look back, don't look now, but look back at Psalm 89 later. You see this firstborn language used of King David, God's appointed king. And here we are told Jesus is that perfect king. So we've seen name, we've seen date of birth, firstborn over creation. Now, next section, main achievements. This is where we kind of get into the meat of it. Well, Jesus, in that achievement section of his CV, he says, very simply, everything was created through me. Everything was created through me. Verse 16. Just take a step back for a minute and think about that. Us, all of us here this morning, created through Jesus. Us here on our little planet Earth, spinning around the sun, just one star in a galaxy of 100 billion other stars. And our galaxy, the Milky Way, just one galaxy, huge as it is, in a universe of 2 trillion or more other galaxies. All of it, all of us, all of this universe, everything we can see, created through Jesus. But it's not just everything that we can see. Everything that we can't see was created through him as well. There's a spiritual world at play in this universe, good and evil. All of that was created by Jesus. All of it is ruled by Jesus. Jesus rules creation. Now, we keep looking down the CV, and then we reach the dreaded gap. I don't know if on your CV you've got that dreaded gap, that period of time where you just don't quite know what to write. Nothing was really happening in your career. It's a bit tricky. Well, Jesus made everything. What's he been doing since then? Are we in that dreaded gap? Well, no, we keep looking down, and we see that since creation, Jesus has been sustaining everything. Since creation, Jesus has been sustaining everything. In him, everything holds together. Verse 17, all things hold together. So my heart is beating. Your heart is beating. Only because Jesus says so. Only because Jesus makes it continue beating. That's a pretty humbling thought for a Sunday morning, I think, isn't it? Now, it's an impressive CV. Jesus rules creation. Jesus rules creation. But if we're honest, it doesn't really seem like that, does it? We look around, we look outside, we open our newspapers, we see Ukraine and Russia on the brink of war. We go out of our front doors, we see trees falling over, storms wreaking havoc. It doesn't really seem like Jesus rules creation, does it? How do we square that with what we see here? Is Jesus kind of being a little bit creative with his CV? Maybe in your mind, come up with your top 3 world problems, whether that's war or famine, cancer, AIDS, whatever. Just briefly in your mind now, come up with your top 3. What are the top 3? Rank them in order. The most difficult world problems to solve. Now, I'd argue that at the very top of your list should be death. Death is that problem that we just have no hope of solving. Death is the problem that everyone wants to solve, but no one's been able to solve. Cancer might be solved in the future. People are working on it. Famine. If we get our acts together, we could surely solve the problem of world famine. Death. Death no one has solved. No one has a hope of solving. Except Jesus has solved it. Jesus has beaten death. He died. He rose again. He was the first. He was the only one to do that. So as we keep looking down that CV, back to his CV, achievements section, 33 AD, Jesus says, I beat death. I beat death. And that means because Jesus has beaten death, I don't know what was in your top 3, but because Jesus has beaten death, that top of the world problems league table, he has beaten everything else underneath, any other problem that we can ever imagine. Jesus has beaten it. He rules over it. And we don't see that fully now, do we? We only see that partially. One day we will see it fully. That's because, if you like, we live between D-Day, the cross, the resurrection. When Jesus won that victory, he really did. We live between then, and we live between then and VE Day, when we'll experience that victory fully when Jesus returns. We live in between D-Day and VE Day, so we see his victory only partially now. Because Jesus has beaten death, he rules salvation. I think that's what Paul is driving at in verses 18 to 20. Jesus rules salvation. So we get to share in Jesus' victory over death. Because, in the words of Colossians, we are kind of connected to Jesus like a body is connected to a head. That means that we get to share in his victory over death. And the only reason that we get to be part of this body is because Jesus has stepped into our lives and he has reconciled us to God. Jesus has reconciled us to God through his blood. So if you're a Christian here this morning, your name is on Jesus' CV. Subheading, people I've reconciled to God. Your name is on there. My name is on there. If you're Christians, Your name is always on there. It's never going to be rubbed off. But if we look carefully at verse 20, it says that Jesus has reconciled to God all things, not just Christians, all things. What does that mean? Is that telling us that everyone is saved or everyone is going to be saved? No, I don't think it does. We need to think about what reconciliation means in kind of Bible terms. Reconciliation for Christians, well, it means that we are friends with God now. We are at peace with God. But reconciliation for everything and everyone in opposition to God means that they've been reconciled just in that. They have been pacified. They've been pacified. Nothing can stop God bringing about his peace that he promises in his new creation. So Jesus rules creation. Jesus rules salvation. He is supreme in every area of our existence because he is God. But do you remember our initial question? How does that help us be here? How does it help us to be satisfied, to feel fulfilled in our Christian lives? Well, I think the answer we're given here is very simple. It feels too simple, in fact. It feels a bit wrong in that it's too simple. But here's what we're being told. We're being told King Jesus is enough. King Jesus is enough. Because of who he is, he's got everything we need. And because we are connected to him like a body is connected to a head, we then have access to him. We have access to everything we need in him. King Jesus is enough. And just as a side note, if you've been wondering how this all connects with our series on the Ten Commandments, we're looking through the Ten Commandments at the moment, and we're going back to the Ten Commandments next week. Well, this week and last week are kind of an extended meditation on the second commandment, where God says, don't make images of God. A commandment that urges us not to add anything to our worship of God, worship that he has commanded. And here's our reason why. We don't add anything because King Jesus is enough. But let's just think for a minute. What does it actually mean that King Jesus is enough? Well, maybe think of our Christian experience as something like a cup. Come with me on this one. Something like a cup. In my experience, sometimes it just feels like Jesus kind of tops it up every now and again, keeps me going, it gives me just enough to keep going. And that's fine, that's wonderful. But then it evaporates, doesn't it? You just feel empty again. Jesus tops. But Jesus is saying no. Colossians 1 is saying no, that's not right. We need to think of our Christian experience a bit more like we're standing perhaps at the bottom of Niagara Falls. Niagara Falls there, if you can see it. So we're standing at the bottom of Niagara Falls. We're saying, Jesus, are you enough? And Jesus says, yes, this is me. Look at Colossians 1. This is me. I am enough. So what are we being asked today? Is this passage just a nice passage about Jesus that we should put in a theological textbook and kind of bring it out every now and again? No, I think Jesus is inviting us today. He's saying, will you live as if I am enough? Will you live as if I am enough? And let's think for a minute what it might look like to say, yes, Jesus, I am going to live as if you are enough. And I think as we think about this, older Christians are a fantastic example for us. We're blessed to have a number here with us this morning. I'm not going to shame them by naming them. But I just want to talk for a minute about an older lady who used to be at St. Luke's, a lady called Jean. Some of you will have known her. Jean died a few years ago and she's now with the Lord. But I think Jean's life was a fantastic example of what it looked like to live a life saying, yes, Jesus, you are enough. I'm sure she wouldn't mind me saying her life was pretty unspectacular in lots of ways. She ran a shop locally, she retired, she moved into a flat up the road. But her life said emphatically, yes, Jesus is enough. And of course, she had good and bad days. There were days where she was more or less satisfied with him. But the shape of her life was, yes, Jesus, you are enough. Even as her health and mobility declined, she was still utterly satisfied with Jesus. Her prayers weren't focused on herself. They were focused on others. She would love for others to come to know that Jesus is enough. There was no bitterness, no dissatisfaction, just a resolute trust in the Jesus who had made her, the Jesus she knew as sustaining her even through her pain, and the Jesus who had reconciled her to the God that she was about to meet as she died. Jean lived as if Jesus is enough. Well, what might it look like for us here this morning to live as if Jesus is enough? Well, we haven't got time to delve into this very deeply, but just a couple of examples. Maybe if a move is on the horizon for you in the next few years, I guess I'm thinking particularly of teenagers who might be off to university in the next few years, but if you're moving anywhere else in the next few years. Perhaps you've been coming along to St. Luke's for a little while, and you're just wondering, what else is out there? I need to find another church when I move. What else is out there? And the answer is, there's all sorts out there. Some churches will say, Jesus is great, but really to be satisfied, to be fulfilled, to be here in your Christian life, you need to do your Sunday morning church services in a very specific way. And if you don't, well, at best, you'll be looking here. Other places might say, yep, Jesus is great, but also you need to have had certain experiences to be here. If you haven't had those experiences, at best you'll be there, and probably you're going to be there. But here in Colossians, we're told that is nonsense. We're told King Jesus is enough. So if you are moving in the next few years, whether that's to university or elsewhere, I would urge you to find a church. Find people who also say, King Jesus is enough. There's nothing else that you need. There is utter satisfaction in him alone. Or maybe you're feeling flat in your Christian life. Not much is going on. It feels like God feels a bit distant. That's how I feel quite often in my Christian life. Well, however we feel, Colossians 1 tells us that we are connected to the King, the one who rules creation, the one who rules salvation. And here's just a brief way that we might be encouraged and encourage others in that. I'm not saying that this is a kind of magic bullet that's going to make us feel satisfied all the time, but it just helps reorient our thinking, I think, to remind ourselves, remind each other that Jesus is enough. So perhaps after the service, just ask someone else here this morning over coffee. Just say, what is your experience of Jesus' rule in your life? What is your experience of Jesus' rule over creation? What is your experience of Jesus' rule over salvation? And that might lead to stories of how someone came to faith. It might lead to stories of what the Lord has been doing in their lives since they came to faith, or things they've heard about others, how God's been at work in other people's lives. But it's just a way of us reminding each other, reminding ourselves that King Jesus rules. He rules creation, he rules salvation, and he is enough. So what would it look like for you to live as if King Jesus is enough? As we close, I'll just leave a few moments of silence for us to think about that question. maybe ask the Lord for his help to highlight an area where he's calling us to live as if Jesus is enough. And then in a few moments, I'll pray. So just a few moments of silence, and then I'll lead us in prayer. Lord Jesus, we praise you for these wonderful verses that tell us all about you. We praise you because you are God, and we praise you because you're enough. Please help us to know that, to believe that more deeply, and to live our lives in such a way that shows that you are enough. Amen.